The waters of the river Ganga were filled with corpses. There was no wood left in crematoriums to cremate the dead. In the blink of an eye, my family had vanished from before me. These lines were written by the celebrated poet Nirala in his novel, Kulli Bhat, in which he describes the grim scenes that unfolded during the Spanish flu epidemic 100 years ago. They are eerily prescient, even more so now because we live in modern times, when such scenes of collective turmoil caused by an abdication of governance ought to be a thing of the past. So, how did we end up witnessing scenes of desolation that belonged in another century? Why were the people of India abandoned by their government, and left to fend for themselves? Why were dead bodies floating down the Ganga, day after day, while the whole world watched aghast? Good governance in a crisis is about confronting the truth, seizing responsibility and taking action. Unfortunately, the Modi government did none of these. Instead, from the beginning of the pandemic, it made every attempt to hide the truth and to shirk responsibility. As a consequence, when the second wave hit us with unprecedented force, the government lapsed into a state of inaction. This inaction enabled the virus to spread with far greater ferocity and cause untold suffering. If only the Prime Minister had acted upon the countless warnings he had been given by experts from India and around the world. If only he had listened to the recommendations of his own empowered group, or even to the Parliamentary Committee on Health, we would not have faced the horrendous shortage of beds, oxygen and medicines that we did. Had he cared about those who looked towards him for leadership, he would not have reduced the number of dedicated COVID beds between the first and the second wave. He would have ordered the tankers required to transport oxygen and prepared for the diversion of industrial oxygen to hospitals. He would not have exported millions of doses of life-saving drugs without ensuring provisions for Indian lives first. Families would not have been put through the trauma of desperately searching for help for their loved ones. We would not have lost so many precious souls just because the Prime Minister had not planned and prepared for what was to come. Had the Prime Minister prioritized the people of India above his own PR and image building, we would not have the shortage of vaccines we have today. Had he woken up from his slumber and ordered vaccines in the summer of 2020 instead of waiting till January 2021, he could have saved countless lives. Instead of distributing free vaccines across the world to boost his own image, had he paused for a moment and protected his countrymen first, we would not be standing in line today grappling with a convoluted registration system designed to slow down the vaccine process. We could have vaccinated a very significant proportion of our population by now, considering we are one of the largest vaccine producers in the world. Had the Prime Minister gathered up the courage to fight the pandemic head-on, he could have taken even his opponents along in this battle for Indian lives. He could have engaged with experts, critics, allies, and the opposition fearlessly. He could have used the media as a disseminator of life-saving information about COVID, rather than as a propaganda tool to promote his own image. He could have welcomed facts and allowed data to be put before the public with transparency. This is what would have allowed for a far more efficient response to the pandemic. Had the Prime Minister put human lives before politics, he would have helped support the states in their heroic battle against COVID-19. As the leader of a nation deep in crisis, he would have sent his colleagues in the states resources, cleared their dues and strengthened their efforts instead of appearing on TV repeatedly to whine and complain about them in a pathetic attempt to abdicate his own responsibilities. Had the Prime Minister been the epitome of governance as his propaganda machine would have us all believe, he would have governed now more than ever before. He would have stepped up to the plate, galvanized every resource, administrative, industrial, financial and political, and lead us through the worst tragedy to have befallen us in more than a century. Had he been an informed and competent leader, he would have planned, strategized and prepared for the inevitable second wave. He would not have set aside the tools of science and modernity and transported us back through tally banging and lamp lighting rituals into the darkness of bygone centuries described by the poet Nirala. Indeed, had the Prime Minister been the man his admirers believed him to be, had he had the mettle of a statesman, or the compassion and bravery of a true leader, he would have come forward and comforted his countrymen when they most needed reassurance and succor. He would have reached out to them with compassion and communicated more than mere platitudes. He would have moved heaven and earth to stand by us all without making excuses. He would have done everything in his power to save lives. He did none of this. He simply retreated and waited for the worst to pass. The Prime Minister of India has behaved like a coward. He has let our country down. The whole world has witnessed his incompetence at governance. His vast capacity for vanity has been exposed. Indians do not come first for him. Politics does. Truth does not concern him, propaganda does. The time has come for us to ask him, Zimmedar kaun?